It is the 8th of June 1867. On this day, the Austrian Emperor, Franz Joseph I, and his wife Elisabeth were solemnly crowned Apostolic Kings of Hungary in Maciej's church on Castle Hill in Buda. This was the symbolic conclusion of years of persistent negotiations between Austria and Hungary to finally reach a compromise that would satisfy both sides. The Habsburg Empire thus became a dual monarchy in which the western and eastern halves of the empire were united under a common ruler through a personal union. It was the birth of Austria-Hungary, which we all know and love. But what exactly was this compromise even about, and why did both sides agree to it in the first place? In order to fully understand the Austro-Hungarian Compromise, we must examine Hungary's special role in the Habsburg Empire. Our story begins in the late 17th century, when Turkish rule over Hungary came to an end. After the unsuccessful siege of Vienna by the Ottomans in 1683, the Habsburgs went on the offensive, advancing eastwards and soon conquering the old Hungarian capital of Buda, or Orphan as the city was known as historically. In 1687, the still underage Joseph was crowned King of Hungary in Pressburg or Pozsony or Prešporok, today's Bratislava. In 1699, the Ottomans ceded Hungary to the Habsburgs in the Treaty of Karlowitz and abandoned their claims. However, relations between the new Habsburg rulers and the Hungarian elites were anything but harmonious at first. An armed uprising led by the nobleman Francis II Rákóczi broke out in response to the absolutist policies of Leopold I, which took several years to quell. The rebels pursued the goal of restoring the Kingdom of Hungary in its old form, free from Habsburg rule. However, after the uprising was crushed militarily, the central question arose as to how power should now be divided between the Hungarian nobles and the Habsburg kings. The Viennese court began to see the ruling Hungarian class as partners rather than opponents and tried to accommodate them to a certain extent, without, however, relinquishing its supremacy. In the words of Emperor Charles VI, "We must show the Hungarians that we want to govern with justice and love." In the Peace of Szatmár in 1711, the rebels were granted amnesty, the old rights of the Hungarian nobility were confirmed, the land ownership remained intact, and a session of the Imperial Diet was convened. In exchange, the Hungarian Diet of 1722 and 1723 approved the Pragmatic Sanction of Charles VI, which established the indivisibility and inseparability of all Habsburg hereditary kingdoms and lands, provided for a uniform order of succession, and allowed Charles's oldest daughter, Maria Theresia, to become Archduchess of Austria and Queen of Hungary. Now, why did the Hungarian nobles agree to become an inseparable part of the Habsburg Empire? First and foremost, this was because only the Habsburgs could guarantee Hungary's security and prevent the Ottomans from reclaiming their lost territories. In addition, the dualistic system introduced by Charles proved acceptable to them. This compromise secured Habsburg rule over Hungary for decades, and the Hungarians remained loyal subjects. When, for example, the War of the Austrian Succession broke out in 1740 and Frederick II of Prussia marched into Austrian Silesia, the Hungarian parliament stood by Maria Theresia and offered her life and blood for the preservation of her empire. Serious conflicts arose again when the enlightened Emperor, Joseph II, assumed sole rule in Austria in 1780 and initiated an ambitious program of reforms. His goal was to create a centralized and unified empire. To this end, he abolished the old Hungarian administrative structure based on counties and replaced it with a division of Hungary into 10 administrative districts, each headed by a royal commissioner. A new, finely structured judicial system was also introduced. Furthermore, Joseph II abolished serfdom and replaced the arbitrary conscription system with a more structured recruitment process. These reforms curtailed many of the traditional privileges of the nobility, which did not win the emperor many friends. Most serious, however, was Joseph's decree making German the official language of the empire and instructing all Hungarian civil servants to conduct their work in German rather than Latin as before. This was by no means an attempt to Germanize the non-German population, but rather to create a unified administration in the empire that used the same language. German was the obvious choice, simply because it was already the most widely spoken language among the educated. But this decision paved the way for national discontent. Officials were outraged that they were suddenly under such rigid imperial control and on top of that had to use a new language. This language decree prompted many educated people in Hungary to start deliberately conversing in Hungarian. Joseph's enlightened reform program had failed. He had overstepped existing boundaries way too much, implemented his ideas too quickly, and failed to appease the ruling nobility. Shortly before his death in 1790, Joseph was forced to revoke most of his reforms. His successor, Leopold II, set out to reach a compromise with the disgruntled Hungarians. In 1791, he agreed with the Hungarian Diet that Hungary would once again become a self-governing country within the Habsburg realm, and that laws could only be enacted with the consent of Parliament. Latin was reintroduced as the official language, and the Hungarian language was to be taught in all schools. This restored peace, and Leopold even managed to retain a not insignificant part of Joseph's reforms in Hungary. After this compromise, the emperor withdrew from Hungary's domestic affairs for the time being, and what followed was an era of political uncertainty, as Austria became embroiled in countless wars against revolutionary France. Both the Hungarian high aristocracy and the members of the lesser nobility continued to support the Habsburgs during this period. On the one hand, they feared the social unrest that could be triggered by the spread of the revolution, and on the other hand, they did not want to fall under the wing of another European great power. In addition, many Hungarian landowners benefited from the wars, as demand for grain had risen dramatically, while at the same time the British competition had been eliminated by the continental blockade established by Napoleon. It was only after the end of the Napoleonic Wars and the reorganization of Europe that Hungarian resistance to the Habsburgs grew. In 1804, Francis II was crowned as Austrian Emperor and the Habsburg monarchy became the Austrian Empire. Hungary itself, however, became a crown land and a period of centralization began. Hungary was unique in that, unlike other regions in Austria, it was able to form a self-confident, broad opposition that came from both the larger cities and rural areas. After 1815, resistance to further centralization in Austria grew among the Hungarians. Individual counties often refused to pay their taxes or provide the prescribed number of recruits for the army. The Habsburgs had no choice but to listen to the complaints and, after a long suspension period, reluctantly reinstated the Hungarian Diet in 1825, which met in Pressburg. These so-called reform diets provided an ideal stage for talented orators who captivated their audience and explained their grievances in the hope that Hungary would be granted greater autonomy. However, the results were rather modest, primarily because the Viennese government was very adept at playing the Hungarians off against each other. On the one hand, it was common knowledge that the aristocratic deputies feared a possible uprising by the peasants above all else, and wanted to prevent the lower classes from gaining political power at all costs. Vienna threatened further social reforms every time the Hungarians demanded autonomy, which proved to be extremely effective. On top of that, Vienna also took advantage of the emerging language problem. You see, by the beginning of the 19th century, Hungarian had developed into a sophisticated language. Neologists and linguists established clear grammatical rules, introduced new words, and translated important foreign works by Rousseau, Voltaire, Goethe, Lessing, and Shakespeare into Hungarian. The Hungarian elite began to identify more and more with the Hungarian language, and many demanded that Latin should be abolished as the language of the church, administration, and politics. Instead, the use of Hungarian was to be promoted throughout the country. The problem, however, was that Hungary was a patchwork of many different languages and peoples, where native Hungarian speakers made up less than half of the population. In addition to Hungarians, there were significant numbers of Germans, Slovaks, Serbs, Croats, Slovenes, Ruthenians, Romanians, Jews, and Roma. It was therefore no surprise that the deliberate spread of Hungarian in this multilingual country would inevitably lead to some problems. In a sense, the use of Latin as the official language had been the best solution, as Latin was no one's mother tongue. Accordingly, members of the various ethnic groups were all equally disadvantaged. However, as the Diet increasingly imposed Hungarian as the national language, deep rifts opened up within the ruling aristocracy. The Croatian nobles in particular fought bitterly to retain the use of Latin in administration. Another consequence of the new language policy was that the concept of the Hungarian nation was completely redefined. Previously, the Hungarian nation consisted exclusively of the Hungarian nobility, who claimed sole ownership of the term. However, with the introduction of a national language that was also spoken by large sections of the lower classes, the concept of nationhood was inevitably expanded to include the rest of the Hungarian-speaking population over time. This raised the question of who would now look after the interests of the lower classes. Since the Hungarian nobility did not want to deal with this, the government in Vienna seized the opportunity and championed the interests of all those who felt neglected by the Hungarian parliament. The Habsburgs generally supported the use of vernacular languages in education and in public life, and protested against the slow permeation of Hungarian. Very unsurprisingly, however, they did not do this out of compassion. The aim was not only to play the Hungarians and non-Hungarians off against each other, but also to prevent non-Hungarian speaking residents from developing their own national identity through repressive language policies, which could further complicate the situation in the country. Due to the self-confident Hungarian opposition to the centralization efforts of the Habsburg Empire, the language problem and the social question, life in Hungary in the early 19th century was extremely politicized by early 19th century standards. As a result, a political conflict broke out in the country, revolving around the question of what Hungary's future should look like and what role it should play in Austria. Roughly speaking, it was a dispute between enlightened conservative reformers and radical socially progressive nationalists. The conservative reformers were personified above all by Count István Széchenyi, who had travelled throughout Europe in his youth and was particularly enthusiastic about the political and economic system of Great Britain. He advocated for slow, gradual economic and political changes to be made in agreement with the Viennese government. Above all, this was intended to make up for Hungary's economic backwardness. His greatest achievements were the founding of the Hungarian Academy in Pest, the establishment of numerous national casinos as a kind of discussion society for the upper classes, the regulation of the Danube and Tisza rivers, and the initiative to build the famous chain bridge, the first permanent bridge connecting the two cities of Olfen and Pest. Ultimately, his reform program was only partially successful, as many of his ideas required the support of the higher nobility, which they never received. His eternal opponent, Lajos Kossuth, who represented the radical nationalists, was cut from a completely different cloth. He wanted to implement changes quickly and free Hungary from Austrian rule, establishing instead an Austro-Hungarian confederation with a separate customs area. He also called for the complete liberation of the peasants, rapid industrialization, the extension of political power to the bourgeoisie, and the introduction of Hungarian as the sole national language. Of the two, Kossuth was clearly the better speaker and rhetorician, and he soon won the support of the liberal petty nobility, while Széchenyi became increasingly marginalized politically. Széchenyi's more moderate strategy, which was intended to prevent a break with Austria, would probably have been more successful. At the 1847 Diet, a relatively open attitude had developed among the lesser nobility, and the chances were not bad that a compromise could be reached that would satisfy all sides. It was not unrealistic to think that reforms such as a parliamentary lower house, the introduction of freedom of the press, or the abolition of tax exemptions for the nobility could have been achieved. But this is all speculation, because the sudden outbreak of the revolution destroyed all progress. Now, the events in Hungary in 1848 and 1849 are actually worthy of their own video, but for the sake of understanding the Compromise of 1867, I would nevertheless like to briefly highlight them here. After the news of the revolution in France reached Pressburg, Kossuth gave an impassioned speech on the 3rd of March 1848, in which he demanded the introduction of a constitutional monarchy, the extension of political power to the middle class and wealthy farmers, and the introduction of civil liberties. Based on this speech, the radical opposition leaders drafted the so-called 12 Points, which aimed to end Vienna's absolutist aspirations and make Hungary a largely autonomous and semi-democratic state. Meanwhile, Kossuth and his supporters had taken power in the Diet and presented their demands to the emperor. In view of the chaotic conditions in Vienna, the feeble-minded emperor, Ferdinand I, had no choice but to agree to these demands. The emperor also agreed to the formation of the first Hungarian government under Count Lajos Batthyány. As a result, the old provincial parliament in Pressburg was abolished and replaced by a national assembly in Ofen. The revolution had been bloodless and its successes were impressive. Hungary had now become a constitutional parliamentary monarchy. Although the Austrian emperor remained King of Hungary, domestic affairs were no longer controlled from Vienna. The country's own currency, the forint, was put into circulation, and a national guard and army were established. But not everyone had reason to celebrate. Non-Hungarian ethnic groups in particular felt neglected as the new government stubbornly refused to introduce special autonomy rights for individual ethnic groups. The situation in Croatia proved particularly explosive. Although Croatia was part of the Crownland of Hungary, it had always enjoyed a special status. It enjoyed significant autonomy and had its own parliament, the Sabor in Agram o Zagreb. The Ban, Josip Jelačić, who held authority over Croatia and most Croatian nobles, strongly disagreed with Hungarian nationality policy and were loyal to the Habsburgs on principle. In April, the Sabor reasserted Croatia's autonomy and pledged loyalty directly to the Habsburgs, rejecting the Hungarian government's authority. Initially, the Austrian government put on a brave face and dismissed Jelačić from his post. However, this was only a symbolic gesture, as the emperor urgently needed Hungary's military support against the rebellious Italians in Lombardy and Veneto, who were also supported by the King of Sardinia. Only after Austria regained the upper hand in Italy in the summer and was also able to crush the Prague uprising, was it able to turn its attention back to the Hungarian problem. Vienna began to supply the Croats with military equipment and reinstated Jelačić in September. On the 11th of September 1848, Jelačić and his army marched across the border with the full support of the emperor. In Cegléd, Kossuth gave a fiery speech and mobilized the Hungarian population to fight for their freedom. Jelačić was initially held back, but preparations were made in Ofen for a prolonged conflict. The Hungarian government was replaced by the Fatherland Defense Committee, which was led by Kossuth, who from then on exercised dictatorial power. After another uprising in Vienna in October and the imperial court was forced to flee again, Kossuth seized the opportunity and sent a Hungarian army to Vienna to support the rebels. However, they were defeated by Austrian-Croatian troops under the command of Jelačić at the Battle of Schwechat on the 30th of October and forced to retreat. From then on, the Habsburg troops were on the offensive and pushed the Hungarians further and further back. On the 2nd of December, Emperor Ferdinand abdicated, paving the way for his nephew, the 18-year-old Franz Joseph. The new emperor was far less lenient than his predecessor had been and did everything in his power to restore his authority throughout the empire. The war continued, and in March 1849, the emperor felt confident enough of victory to declare the Hungarian constitution null and void and bring Hungary back under his control. Franz Joseph imposed the March Constitution, which abolished the historic constitutions of all Habsburg lands, including Hungary's, and centralized power in Vienna. The fronts hardened, and a compromise seemed increasingly unlikely. Kossuth, on the other hand, stubbornly refused to give up and watch his life's work being destroyed. Instead, he and the government, which had fled to Debrecen or Debrecen, declared Hungary's complete independence from Vienna on the 19th of April. Afterwards, the tide of war turned for a short time, and in May the Hungarians even managed to recapture Ofen and Pest. By now, resistance against Kossuth was also beginning to form within the Hungarian nobility. Many were opposed to a complete break with the Habsburgs, while others considered the continuation of the war to be futile bloodshed and feared that a prolonged war would inevitably strengthen the desire of the Hungarian lower classes for political equality with the old elites. The fate of independent Hungary was ultimately sealed when, in June of 1849, the Russian Tsar, Nicholas I, intervened to prevent the revolution from spreading to his own territories. The Hungarians were simply powerless against the combined forces of the Austrian and Russian armies. By August of that year, General Artur Görgey saw no other option but to surrender at Arad. The attempt to create a constitutional nation-state in Hungary under the banner of moderate liberalism had thus been bloodily crushed. Now the imperial government in Vienna wanted to ensure that a national revolutionary uprising of that scale could never be repeated. Kossuth himself managed to flee to the Ottoman Empire, but the other supporters of the revolution paid dearly. Despite the Tsar's promise of safe conduct, General Julius von Haynau, acting on the orders of the Austrian head of state, Felix zu Schwarzenberg, and with the approval of the emperor, had 13 Hungarian generals executed in Arad. On the same day, so on the 6th of October 1849, the former Prime Minister, Lajos Batthyány, who was actually a moderate and who had done everything in his power to prevent the armed conflict between the Hungarian nation and the Habsburgs, was also shot in Pest. In addition, around 2,000 Hungarian officers and patriots were imprisoned. The brutal reaction of the Austrian state to the events of 1848 and 1849 led to the formation of strong resistance on the part of the Hungarians, which proved to be extremely difficult to break. The generals executed at Arad gained the status of martyrs, and the lost War of Independence became a national tragedy to be remembered. In the long term, the central government in Vienna had permanently weakened its position in Hungary, which would become very clear just over a decade later. But at that point, it had overwhelmingly triumphed and completely asserted its power in Hungary. Now, a period was dawning throughout the Habsburg Empire that is generally referred to in historical scholarship as Neoabsolutism. After having suppressed the revolution, Emperor Franz Joseph and his circle were emboldened in their plan to create a centralized state in Austria without a constitution and without any political participation by the people. On the 31st of December 1851, the emperor issued the so-called New Year's Eve patent, in which he declared the March constitution, which was only 2 years old and had never been fully implemented, null and void. Instead, a new Austrian state was created that turned away from the ideas of conservative constitutionalism and the principles of the revolution. The individual crown lands were deprived of their traditional independence and given a uniform, hierarchical structure controlled directly by Vienna. In addition, public court proceedings were abolished, as was the autonomy of the individual municipalities, while a strict regime of censorship was introduced. Nevertheless, some achievements of the revolution were retained, such as equal rights for all citizens, equal rights for all nationalities, and the complete liberation of peasants from their dependence on the landlords. For the Hungarian elites, this New Year's Eve patent was completely unacceptable and a national disgrace. The abolition of the Hungarian constitution, which had become a symbol of Hungarian self-identity, was perceived as a painful affront. However, the territorial destruction of the traditional unity of the Hungarian kingdom must have been the worst blow of them all. Transylvania, Croatia, Slavonia, Banat and Vojvodina were separated from Hungary, and the rest of Hungary was divided into 5 administrative districts. The new officials who flocked into Hungary to help build up the powerful administrative apparatus were mockingly called Bach Hussars in reference to the head of the Austrian government, Alexander von Bach, who personified the neo-absolutist system. However, the new system did not only have disadvantages for Hungary. The extension of the Austrian law book, the introduction of a new code of criminal procedure, efficient administration, and the abolition of customs barriers between Hungary and Austria were all aimed at further modernizing the country and were intended to make the citizens more aware of the advantages of the unconstitutional system. Nevertheless, these advantages could not hide the fact from Hungarian nationalists that Hungary had entered a period of Austrian foreign rule. The Viennese government was aware of this fact, which is why it announced that the new administrative order was supposedly only a temporary measure. While this strangely never-ending temporary measure continued to persist, many Hungarians engaged in demonstrative passive resistance against the government. The embodiment of this resistance was the liberal Ferenc Deák, who had been Minister of Justice in 1848 and insisted on the validity of the Hungarian constitution. In April of 1850, he refused to meet with the Austrian Minister of Justice, Anton von Schmerling, to harmonize the new legal processes. He justified this by saying, "After the regrettable events of the recent past and in the prevailing circumstances, it is not possible to cooperate actively in public affairs." This made him a central figure of identification, and even though he did not directly engage in large-scale political campaigns, many Hungarians followed his example. Deák argued that the Austrian system after 1849 was not legally valid and advocated for non-violent resistance against the Habsburgs. He also deliberately promoted Hungarian national sentiment by frequently visiting important cultural and scientific institutions in the country, such as the academy or the casino, and by urging his readers to persistently speak Hungarian in everyday life. Now, however one chooses to assess the extent of Deak's influence on society as a whole, passive resistance against the Habsburgs did indeed become the core of the Hungarian struggle for freedom. Many refused to pay taxes or enter military service, demonstratively attended theatre or opera performances by Hungarian authors, refused to go to government offices or courthouses because German was usually spoken there, or wore clothes in green, white and red colours. Public celebrations were also deliberately held, such as on Kossuth's birthday or on the anniversaries of the April Constitution and the Declaration of Independence. When Emperor Franz Joseph was almost assassinated by a Hungarian tailor in Vienna in February 1853 and escaped with an injury, the Hungarians at home refused to attend the memorial services. In contrast, 2 years later, almost 20,000 people attended the funeral of the famous writer Mihály Vörösmarty. The fascinating thing about the passive resistance of the Hungarians was that it spread throughout almost the entire society and involved all social classes without being controlled by a charismatic leadership, even if the exact extent of it is still heavily disputed until today. The Austrian Neoabsolutist system was seen as an oppressive regime that had taken away the Hungarians' parliament, their constitution, their autonomy, and their freedom of expression. Even those sections of the nobility who would have been willing to cooperate in principle and hoped for a civil service position, for example, were alienated in the long run by the Habsburgs' uncompromising policies. This undoubtedly undermined Austria's state power, but it would take a military catastrophe to bring down neo-absolutism. Said military catastrophe occurred in 1859, when Austria suffered a crushing defeat against Sardinia-Piedmont and France and was forced to cede the wealthy region of Lombardy. In order to maintain his own legitimacy and that of his state afterwards, Franz Joseph had no choice but to reform his system of government and to introduce a parliament in Austria. However, opinions differed on what the new Austria should look like. On the one hand, there was a group of conservative aristocrats who wanted to restore the autonomy of the individual crownlands and establish a federalist system. Control over regional politics and legislation was to lie once again with the provincial diets. On the other hand, there were the liberals, who were mainly drawn from the capitalist and educated classes. They wanted a strong central state with an empire-wide parliament whose members were elected and had great powers. They also demanded a constitution that separated powers and granted civil rights. The only thing that both sides could agree on was that political participation by the property-less classes should be prevented at all costs in order to avoid a repeat of the events of 1848 and because they deemed the commoners to be politically irresponsible. Initially, the emperor sympathized with the conservatives. In 1860, he appointed the Polish count, Agenor Boulder, as Minister of the Interior and issued the October Diploma, which laid down the basic principles of a constitutional monarchy. The provincial parliaments were to be reintroduced and an imperial council with 100 members was to be created, which would only have an advisory function and whose sole task was to review the state budget. This weakened the authority of Vienna, while the crownlands gained more power. However, the October Diploma did not satisfy the Hungarian politicians. On the one hand, the Hungarian constitution was still not recognized, while Hungary remained only part of the Habsburg Empire without any special rights. But even outside of Hungary, there was severe criticism of the October Diploma from liberals, who described it as a step backwards compared to 1848. Just a few months after its introduction, Franz Joseph saw no other option than to abandon the October Diploma, dismiss Gołuchowski, and create a new constitution. The new head of government, Anton von Schmerling, was entrusted with this task, and in February of 1861, the February patent was ready. Now the Imperial Council actually had far-reaching legislative powers, and the wealthy voters of all the crownlands could send their representatives to Vienna and exert massive influence on the politics of the Habsburg Empire. Although the February patent went a long way towards accommodating the Hungarians by restoring the Hungarian Diet, promising them a large number of seats in the Imperial Council, and holding out the prospect of ending the territorial division, Hungarian politicians continued to resist. They refused to send members to the joint parliament. There was no obvious reason for this obstruction, but public opinion in Hungary was permeated by the idea of refusing all cooperation with Vienna until the country's independence and the restoration of the constitution were granted. But of course the Hungarian political elite was by no means united in its resistance. While the sympathizers of the exiled Kossuth and the radicals of 1848 insisted on the country's complete independence, the liberal and conservative members of the Diet around Ferenc Deák were prepared to recognize Franz Joseph as king, who actually was considered by many Hungarians to be an illegitimate ruler. Although the emperor considered himself to be king of Hungary, he hadn't undergone a ceremonial coronation in Hungary after coming to power, as his predecessors had always done. The moderates did not want to give up their ties to Austria, because a sovereign Hungary would hardly have been able to defend its independence against the other European great powers. In return, a list of grievances was to be presented to the emperor in the hope that an agreement could be reached on the Hungarian question. However, Franz Joseph wanted nothing to do with it and rejected the petitions twice before closing the Diet in August of 1861. This left the conflict between Hungary and Austria in limbo for the time being, until another big war loomed, this time with Prussia. In 1864, Prussia and Austria had still been working together to wrest the provinces of Schleswig and Holstein from the Danish king, but now an armed conflict between these two German great powers was imminent. The issue at stake was nothing less than supremacy in Germany, and Prussia, under its Chancellor Otto von Bismarck, was now determined to remove the Austrian Empire from German affairs. The government in Vienna was well aware of this, which is why it was keen to seek reconciliation with Hungary. The Hungarians also realized that the time had come to enter into negotiations. In April of 1865, Ferenc Deák published the so-called Easter Articles, in which he outlined his conditions for the formation of an Austro-Hungarian personal union under Franz Joseph. In doing so, he almost single-handedly ended passive resistance and paved the way for a compromise. Vienna responded by replacing the disputed Schmerling cabinet with a new cabinet under the declared conservative Richard Belcredi. Belcredi himself recognized the conflict with Hungary as the biggest domestic political problem and sought to establish a moderate federalist system. To this end, he abolished the constitution, under which a compromise had not been possible, and abolished censorship. In the summer of 1865, Franz Joseph paid a friendly visit to Ofen and Pest and agreed to the incorporation of Transylvania into Hungary. In December, the emperor opened the Hungarian Diet and recognized the formal validity of the laws of 1848, which finally allowed serious negotiations to take place. Deák and Count Gyula Andrássy served as negotiators on the Hungarian side. At first, the negotiations progressed slowly as both sides were playing for time in view of the impending war with Prussia. Vienna was firmly convinced that it would make short work of the Prussians and then use its improved negotiating position towards Hungary to its advantage. The Hungarians saw things differently. Despite their loyalty to the monarchy, they hoped for an Austrian defeat that would improve their position. After the war broke out in June of 1866, the Hungarian parliament was closed and further negotiations were postponed. In July, the decisive battle took place near the Bohemian town of Königgrätz, or Hradec Králové, with the Prussian army emerging as the clear victor. The defeat was overwhelming, and Austria's chances of victory in this war were gone in one fell swoop. When the devastating news of the outcome at Königgrätz reached Vienna, the political hour of a personality who still enjoys cult status in Hungary today had come. Empress Elisabeth, known as Sisi, the wife of Franz Joseph. Elisabeth had developed a strong affinity for the Hungarian nation over many years, appreciating its desire for freedom and its relaxed nature. She sympathized strongly with the failed Hungarian Revolution of 1848 and had made the effort to learn the notoriously difficult Hungarian language. A few days after the Battle of Königgrätz, Elisabeth hurried to Ofen. She knew that she had the best relations with Hungary within the imperial family, and that she had to prevent Hungary from seceding from the monarchy at all costs. She and her children were ceremoniously welcomed at the train station by Deák and Andrássy, and Elisabeth was to spend 2 whole months in Hungary. She wrote incessantly to her husband, urging him to reach an agreement with the Hungarians immediately. She was greatly influenced by Andrássy, with whom she had a close friendship and who repeatedly told her that she alone could now save the monarchy. On the 15th of July, after a conversation with Andrássy, she wrote another letter to the emperor urging him to act now. He, she means Andrássy, expressed his views clearly and unequivocally. I understood them and became convinced that if you trust him completely, then we, and not Hungary alone, but the monarchy, can still be saved. But you must talk to him yourself, and right away, because every day that passes could change the situation so much that he would ultimately refuse to take it on. At such a moment, it really takes a great deal of sacrifice to do so. So talk to him right away. Further down in the same letter, she also struck an almost blackmailing tone. If you say no, if you don't even want to hear unselfish advice at the final hour, then you are really acting unli towards us all. You will then be relieved of my requests and nagging forever, and I will have no choice but to console myself with the knowledge that, whatever happens, I will be able to say honestly to Rudolf, who is their son and the heir to the throne, I did everything in my power. I do not have your misfortune on my conscience. Thereupon, Franz Joseph, against the advice of his mother and his ministers, relented and summoned both Deák and Andrássy to Vienna to hear their arguments. The importance of Elisabeth's actions in bringing about the settlement cannot be overestimated. She was the one who initiated the mediation between the emperor and the moderate Hungarian politicians in the first place, and skillfully used her connections to make a settlement possible in this difficult situation. After the peace negotiations with Prussia were concluded in August, talks could finally begin. In October, Franz Joseph appointed the former Saxon head of government, Friedrich Ferdinand von Beust, as foreign minister, and instructed him to reach an agreement with Hungary. Beust was a skilled diplomat and, unlike his counterpart Belcredi, did not insist on the continuation of a unified Austrian state and agreed to a dualistic solution. He also had the support of the German liberals in the Imperial Council. They saw the division of the country into a western half dominated by German Austrians and an eastern half dominated by Hungarians as the ideal solution for keeping the increasingly politicized Slavic minorities in check. They insisted on the dualistic solution and even threatened the state with obstruction and secession if it did not comply with their wishes. Beust justified the division of the Habsburg Empire into an Austro-Hungarian dual monarchy to Belcredi as follows. The government will never be able to satisfy all nationalities in its domestic policy. At the present moment, when their tendencies diverge so widely and it is impossible for the government to satisfy everyone, its task is to rely on those who possess the most vitality, are spiritually closer to each other, and whose mutual interests directly overlap, namely the German and Hungarian elements. At the end of February 1867, the negotiations were finally concluded. Gyula Andrássy was appointed Prime Minister of Hungary, the Hungarian constitution was reintroduced with a few amendments, Transylvania and Banat were incorporated into Hungary, and the Hungarian parliament was restored. Parliament approved the compromise by a clear majority and swore allegiance to the Habsburgs. The compromise was finalized on the 8th of June 1867 when Franz Joseph and Elisabeth were ceremoniously crowned. As a sign of reconciliation, the new King of Hungary dedicated the coronation gift to the veterans of the Hungarian army who had fought against him back in 1849. In return, the Hungarian government presented the couple with the magnificent Baroque palace of Gödöllő. Elisabeth in particular appreciated this gift very much, as the palace became one of her favourite places to stay. Back in Vienna, Franz Joseph also convened parliament in Austria and appointed the liberal Karl Giskra as president of the House of Representatives. In return for agreeing to the compromise with Hungary, the emperor promised the liberal majority that he would also draw up a constitution for Austria. After several months of discussions, Franz Joseph finally approved the constitution in December of 1867, transforming Austria into a liberal constitutional monarchy. From then on, the old Austrian unitary state, which had been proclaimed in 1804, was divided into three internal divisions. First, the Kingdom of Hungary, which was completely independent in its internal affairs. Then the western part of the country, officially called the Kingdoms and Countries represented in the Imperial Council, but for simplicity's sake also referred to simply as Austria. And finally, the Austro-Hungarian dual monarchy. From then on, Austria and Hungary had only a common ruler, a common military, a common foreign policy, and a closely networked economy. Once a year, delegations from both countries met to discuss budgets relating to common affairs, and every 10 years the economic framework conditions were renegotiated. Otherwise, both countries governed themselves independently of each other and differed in many respects, especially in administration and justice. At the head of this new system was the Emperor, Franz Joseph, who controlled over military and foreign affairs. He was a die-hard bureaucrat, and out of a sense of duty, he strictly adhered to the newly forged constitutions and, after a while, even knew them better than most of his ministers. As the American historian Peter Judson rightly notes, it was an almost ironic twist of fate that the same man who had suspended the Hungarian constitution back in 1849, crushed the revolution and had Hungarian freedom fighters shot, now became one of the most reliable protectors of the new constitution. Many conservative Austrians and supporters of the military were far from enthusiastic about this compromise, especially those who could still remember the revolution of 1848. In Vienna, there were fears of an outbreak of anarchy now that Austrian central power no longer ruled over the Hungarian steppes. They doubted the ability of the new Hungarian government to maintain order in their country. However, these concerns proved to be exaggerated. The long-lasting liberal government under Kálmán Tisza, which came to power in 1875, led the country into the modern era by initiating centralization, modernizing the administration, and reforming the tax system. Equally serious were the Austrians' complaints that the Kingdom of Hungary had a 50% say in joint matters such as the army and foreign policy, but only bore 30% of the costs. However, this 30% was still much more than Hungary had contributed to state revenues over the period of Neoabsolutism, and over the decades this quota was slowly increased. Overall, the compromise proved to be a stable, lasting solution that preserved the emperor's authority in all important aspects and turned the Hungarian elites into loyal subjects of the Habsburgs. But that does not mean that relations were always harmonious. First of all, there was the fundamental dispute as to whether Austria and Hungary were two autonomous parts of a single state or two sovereign states. In addition, both sides always tried to gain the best advantages for themselves in the joint economic negotiations held every 10 years. As a result, almost every one of these negotiations from the 1890s onwards became a trial of strength involving bluffs, threats, and blackmailing. In 1902, for example, it took lengthy negotiations involving trade associations, the threat of resignations by both prime ministers, and several crisis meetings with the emperor before an agreement was actually reached. In Austria, many began to view Hungary as a troublesome annoyance that should just be disposed of. The compromise was increasingly seen as a burden rather than an opportunity. For example, the liberal deputy, Josef Maria Bernreiter, argued, "In Austria, proper government will not be possible as long as the Hungarian Compromise calls everything into question from time to time and forces governments to negotiate and make concessions." The situation became particularly explosive in 1905, when the Hungarian liberals lost their majority in parliament for the first time since 1867 and were replaced by the Radical Independence Party led by Ferenc Kossuth, the son of the famous revolutionary. They fundamentally questioned the dualistic compromise and demanded the creation of a separate Hungarian army and a Hungarian foreign ministry. Franz Joseph refused to make any concessions to the nationalists and instead appointed a loyal minority government led by the liberals. The radicals then declared national resistance by boycotting tax payments and conscription. They also formed a kind of counter-government with their leadership committee, bringing Hungary to the brink of a civil war. The situation was only diffused when the emperor and the Hungarian interior minister threatened to introduce universal suffrage, which the radicals also strongly opposed. This would have given political equality not only to the lower classes, but also to the heavily discriminated and dissatisfied non-Hungarian nationalities, which would have threatened Hungarian supremacy and destroyed the self-image of the Hungarian nation-state. After the parliament was dispersed by the military and the leadership committee was dissolved, an agreement was reached on the formation of a moderate government in which the radicals were given a few ministerial posts. The worst was thus prevented, but the question of how the balance of power between Austria and Hungary should be maintained in the future remained pretty much unresolved until the fall of the Habsburg Empire in 1918. Dankeschön for watching until the end, and I hope you enjoyed the video. I just wanted to let you know that I do have a Patreon account where you can help me make more videos in the future if you have some spare cash on the side. In exchange, you'll get access to a Patreon-exclusive Discord server, and depending on your tier, a number of other sweet benefits, like early access to my videos, for example. In any case, I want to give a special shout-out to my biggest supporters, without whom this wouldn't be possible. Marius Gerling, Lieder Titan, Der dicke Flipper, Ich liebe Emden und Groningen, Maurice Lopez, Lucy Tara I, Hrabienka Horacka, Flannel Enjoyer, Defender, A Cup of Tea, Tristan Kriegsmann, Ryan Layton, Celestia, the Grand Duke of Sealand, Luca Drole, Vidve, Pseudoriser, Lyle Furphy, Yin, Big Dave, Folling, Turd Hambone, and Johnny No Cash. Have a very nice day, and see you next time.